Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see a lot of familiar faces and names and also some new people here. So we'll be talking about budget preparation today, which seems to be a very important topic in financial management. And it seems to have a lot of complex reputation, almost a scary kind of reputation around it. Oh, we're working on the budgets for the year. That is, intense and a lot of work. Well, in reality, for the ones of you that have been attending our sessions, you know that I always like to say the financial reporting part is telling us a story. It's never disconnected from what is happening in our organization, what is happening in our lives day to day. And with budgets, that's a great illustration because really to make an efficient budget, you first have to think about your story, about your operations, right? About what's going on. So a key to budget is understanding really well the program you're budgeting for, right? So sometimes we're not the ones that understand the program really well, right? Sometimes we're the finance person, or maybe we're just helping someone out. Well, in that case, we just meet with a person who understands the program the best. We collect the information and help convert that story into some numbers, right? Into some cost categories and some numbers. So now, if what I'm saying still sounds complicated, think about what you do in your head at home. Well, you budget for your household every month, right? At least in your head, you know how much money is coming in, the expenses that are going out, the unexpected costs, the rising costs because of inflation and so on. Well, and I always like to think about a trip to Las Vegas because it's fun to think about, right? So if I'm planning a trip to Las Vegas, I have to think about, okay, what's involved? Well, there is a flight, right? I have to get a hotel room, I have to get some meals, and then of course entertainment. And so I have categories in my head based on what I'm going to do on that trip. And then I assign costs based either on some research that I do or maybe based on my experience. So anytime you approach a budget in your organization, the first thing is to not get intimidated. It's no different than you planning a Las Vegas trip. It just may not be as much fun, but it really is quite creative because you're taking a story and converting it into some tangible financial numbers, making it very useful. Another thing about a budget, this is not audited information. This is not something super scrutinized information. Budget is an estimate, right? So even if we make a budget and our actual costs or revenues aren't the same, aren't exactly the same, or maybe they're completely out, that is okay. That is actually good because that is helping us tell a story, right? Because when we have a budget and then we have the actual numbers, we put the two together, and any differences in our cost categories and our revenues, they're the ones that help us tell a story. Because when we prepared our budget, we had certain expectations, right? Say we said our wages are going to be a certain amount because we had free finance advisors, right? At the time when we prepared the budget. But then we decided to expand, and now we need another finance advisor during the year. So we hire one and our cost goes up. So of course my wages in the actual report are going to be different. They're going to be higher than the budget, but this is good. This is what makes the budget meaningful because now we get to tell a meaningful story about our operations, right? So now saying that, sometimes the budgets are really not meaningful. Sometimes what we do is maybe we're short of time. I know it happened to me before. We just take last year's budget, we look at it, we go, good enough, and we carry it forward. Okay? So in that case, the budget may not be so meaningful. But just remember, in any case, there are no harsh consequences. It's creative work, and all you're trying to do is do your best at estimating, given your knowledge of the program or the project. And again, it's always good to consult somebody who has more knowledge about the program itself, about the activities, and about what's planned for the next year or for the project. So let's get into our presentation here. Okay, so there's some technical stuff here. A budget is a future income statement, our estimate of revenue and expenses and surplus or deficit for a program or a project. A budget is arguably the most important financial management tool for setting our goals and for managing performance, right? Because everything we do in our organization is measured through financial reporting. And how do we have that story about our operations? How do we measure the financial reporting? Is by comparing it to our goals. And the budget is actually the financial goal, right? So budget should be useful and realistic. Otherwise, it's not a good financial management tool. Good budgets help prevent overspending and financial reporting errors, right? So when we compare our actual spending to the budget, we can catch maybe some misallocated expenses, right? Because if my budget says a certain amount in, say, equipment purchases, and all of a sudden my actual equipment purchases are way higher, well, that gets me to look into the actual purchases and say, okay, maybe this equipment doesn't belong to this program. It got in here in error, right? Or maybe it does belong to the program, and I can see that we're spending too much on equipment, and hopefully I see it early enough in the year so I can manage my spending better. So the budget is a very important tool for that. Most financial reporting requires a budget versus actual report, because again, this is how we're being measured for our program performance. So there are two types of budgets in general for First Nations that we're going to cover here. So one type is for an ongoing program. So for a program that keeps going every year, right? With some changes, maybe there is more funding, maybe there's different activities, but it's an ongoing program. And then we have the one-off programs, which normally come through funding proposals, right? So the government comes out with some sort of a new program. They send a request for proposals out. We get this information, and those proposals would all require some sort of a budget. Some of them would have a budget template, so that's in a way easier. We can follow that. Some of them don't have a budget template, or it's very basic, and we have to kind of put more work into the structure of the budget. Okay. So let's talk through the preparation of a budget for ongoing programs. So if we are in the First Nation, we have ongoing programs like band support, like medical transportation, and so on and so forth. And so for those programs, we want to prepare an annual budget. Now, some of them, like medical transportation, the budget would actually be prepared by the government for us, but that's more of a one-off. For most of our programs at the First Nation, it's our responsibility to prepare the budgets. So this is actually a pretty simple process, because all we need to do is take our most recent annual income statement, the actual numbers from the last year. Now we can take it from the audit if our audit is timely, right? But if my last completed audit is for 2019, 2020, maybe I shouldn't use that one for the current year, because things have changed really significantly since then, likely, right? So if I don't have my most recent audit timely, I would get just an income statement for the program from my internal software, accounting software, right? So now it's of course important that that income statement has accurate numbers. So if we're not so sure our numbers are accurate in that particular year, maybe we'll go back 1 year. If we know for sure, maybe that one has gone to the auditor, so the numbers are accurate, right? So we want to make sure that it's a kind of a complete, the most complete and accurate income statement we can use, right? So now with that, remember that there are certain things in that budget that we already know, right? So your revenue, your funding that comes from the government, you already know, because the government gives you this master contribution agreement once a year. We sign it sometime in March that has a budget for the year, right? And if even if we prepare our budgets way ahead of that time, because we're more proactive and financially managed much better, we can still estimate it pretty accurately based on the current year, right? So our top line, our funding always comes from the government sources. There's no work to do on it, right? If it's a government funded program. Now, for most of our programs, the biggest expense is payroll at the First Nation or at the nonprofit, right? The exceptions would be income assistance, where your biggest expense again is income assistance, or maybe some capital projects where the biggest expense is equipment. For most programs where you're delivering services, your biggest expense is payroll. And payroll, once again, it's a low-hanging fruit, so to say. It's pretty easy because for ongoing program, you already have your staff, you know who's on payroll, and you know how much they're paid, okay? So now with payroll, there is two ways to do it. There is a lazy way to do it where you look at last year, you take the number, if you know your employees are the same, no employees are being added. So we can take last year's payroll and we can maybe add 5%, 2% or 5% to it, depending on what we think is going to happen. Will there be raises or maybe not? But you know, the government deductions increase every year, like our EI contributions increase every year. If you're in a CPP program, that increases, and then your pension plan, group insurance, that may change, right? So I always like to add at least 2%. You can add 5 to be more conservative. Now with payroll, we also know normally if we hire in a new person or if somebody is leaving at the time we prepare the budget. If we don't know, if we're in finance, then we go ask the program managers, okay, what are the plans? Who's gonna work in this program, right? So based on that, we will adjust. So we know there is an extra person, we can also ask, well, approximately how much are they going to be paid? And then, you know, based on that, just adjust that budget, right? So that's the lazy way. Now the good way, right? But it doesn't always have to be used. It's just if you have a person who can help you out or you have the skills, we can actually prepare a payroll breakdown by person and by month, right? So we'd have a list of our employees, then we'll have 12 months in our budget if we prepare an annual budget. And then for every month, we would have payroll by a person based on their hourly rate, and based on the hours they work. And also we kind of know the rate of employment insurance, group insurance, and pension payments that we make, so we can add that onto it. So why is it helpful? Well, because there is, most payroll is bi-weekly, right? And there is normally 2 months in the year that have 3 payrolls instead of 2. So this way, if we do this detailed calculation, our payroll becomes more accurate. Now, again, you may have a good admin or finance person who can assist you with that. And if you don't, that's okay. The lazy way is good. I use the lazy way many times because remember, with a budget, it's an estimate. It doesn't have to be exact to the penny, right? As long as the big picture is right. If we spent $300,000 last year on payroll, this year I may increase it to say 310 or 320 just for cost of living and general raises. If nobody is there, and my actual payroll comes in at $15,995, it's good. There is no issue at all. And if it comes in different, well, maybe there is a story behind it, right? Maybe there was one less person or maybe one more person, right? So with a budget, we don't have to use the exact numbers, but if you have the ability to calculate payroll in the way I described, that's kind of good, okay? Because payroll is normally our biggest expense and it's not too hard to do that more accurate calculation. So we can use that method as well. So now think about it. For most of our programs, we know the revenue, we kind of know the payroll, or we did the calculation, right? So that is the biggest items in our budget. So now, what do we do after that? Well, we can go through the expenses in our last income statement and address the ones that we know are for sure the same, right? Like if we have if we have monthly insurance payments, for instance, right? Or if we have, I don't know, some membership fees, some office expenses that are pretty similar from year to year, or maybe they increased by 5%, or maybe like, just a little increase, then we can just use that next. So I always like to go with the ones I know for sure first, right? Because that's the majority of my budget for ongoing programs. So then for all these expenses that we kind of know aren't changing that much, again, I'm going to choose to add 2 or 5% to them, just because unfortunately cost of living has been increasing. It's never decreasing really, right? So far, we haven't lived in those times. So with that, I will have the majority of my budget filled out just from the stuff that I know. Now we get into the stuff that we don't necessarily know. Maybe some expenses may change, right? Maybe some program costs, maybe some travel expenses. In particular, if your last budget was for a COVID year, well, your travel expenses are different now. And notice that every item I look at, I'm going to think about, okay, what has changed? What's my story? Right? So if my chief and council travel looks ridiculously low, well, it's only because it was a COVID year. And in the coming year, if I'm preparing a budget for next year, I know there's going to be a lot of travel. So my travel amount may be substantially higher, right? But basically, we're going line by line and asking ourselves or the program director or somebody that knows the program a question. Okay, what is changing in our operations, and how is this category effective, right? If we know we need new laptops for all our staff, well, in our equipment purchases, we should reflect that, right? And again, do not worry about not being exact. I've never seen somebody getting in trouble for budget. Like literally, I've never seen that in over 20 years being an accountant, okay? As long as you have a good rationale for why certain numbers are used in the budget, we're good. Again, this is based on the story we know now. If the story changes, which it always does, right? Like our actual operations are rarely the same as planned, just like our life, right? It's okay. The story changes. The budget is not there to confirm or deny whether we're right or wrong. It's there to provide that measurement tool and explain the changes in operations. So as long as you use what's known right now and reflect that in a budget, we're good. Okay, so let's go through some formal steps here. So again, we're going to use most recent annual program income statement as the basis. It's good to think of our goal, right? Because it can be surplus, it can be just break even, or it can be a deficit, right? And for like the book, the school idea of a budget, it always has to be balanced. But in real life, it's rarely the case, right? Most programs would have either a surplus or a deficit. Some may have a small surplus or a small deficit, so it's close to balance. So it's good for the budget to be realistic. If I know that my First Nation has a bunch of plumbing issues, well, when I'm budgeting for building O&M or for housing O&M, and I know I don't have enough funding for plumbing, I'm going to budget the loss in there, right? For that to be meaningful, because my leadership and whoever's looking at my reporting need to see, well, we have a lot of plumbing issues and we actually need more money to fix them, right? Start with what we know, funding and payroll. Revenue comes from the funding agreement. If you're starting it earlier than you have the funding agreement for next year, estimate based on last year, add 5%, go with that. Finance staff can help with payroll calculations, right? And the payroll again is going to be based on the current payroll and expected program staffing. Then we continue to recurring expenses such as rent, equipment lease, admin fees. So we can use the current amounts and again add a bit to it to reflect the cost of living increase. We estimate the less consistent expenses such as travel, honoraria, training, etc., based on last year with adjustments for the anticipated program activities, right? Pretty straightforward. And again, I find the biggest block is we get intimidated, especially us in finance. We just want to be exact, right? Because we run financial reporting, it's exact. Well, a budget is not the same. A budget is the creative part of financial accounting. So if you're an accountant, if you're a finance person, admin person working with it, this is your opportunity to be creative. You don't need to be exact. Okay, so after we've done all that work, remember we had a goal. We knew that that program is going to be in a surplus, a deficit, or break even. So now we're going to check the bottom line. Are we meeting that goal, right? And is it consistent with my expectation? Because maybe I thought there is a deficit and plumbing, but when I look at it, it's like $500,000 deficit, right? So, and maybe I expected the 100,000. So that's not consistent. So if it's not consistent what I expected, this is when I'm going over the expenses and revenue again to see if anything needs to be adjusted, right? Maybe I went too high with the contract fees for plumbing. Maybe I haven't considered some revenue that may come, I don't know, maybe income assistance when we pay user fees into that program. So we can cover some increased plumbing costs. So if it is impossible to adjust, right, after I look at it, we really have to get creative. This is where we go to program manager, maybe to the leadership, and we say, look, I look very closely at the plumbing O&M program, and there is $500,000 deficit based on our expected spending. We need more money. Okay, and this is when the discussion happened. This is why the budget is such an important financial management tool, because you're expecting a big deficit and then you're going to do something about it. You're going to at least bring it up to the leadership so that their wheels start spinning. Maybe they reach out to the funders, or maybe they look for money elsewhere to fund the deficit. Or if we're expecting a big surplus, if I went through my program and all of a sudden I see a huge surplus in there, which is never a good idea for a funded program, right? That surplus will need to be spent at some point. The only program where you get to keep a surplus is a grant contribution, such as Ben support, but that's pretty much, there aren't many grant contributions that we get. And I rarely see Ben support with a big surplus, right? Because you have a lot to do for your administrative activities at the First Nation. So if there is a big surplus, another discussion has to happen. We have to sit down our program staff and talk to them and say, look, we got more money than we expected. We have to do more activities. What can we do this year to spend that surplus, right? So again, it's all common sense, right? If somebody gives me $10,000 to spend in Las Vegas and they say, spend it all, whatever you don't spend, you have to pay me back. Well, I'm going to work hard to find ways to spend it, right? So it's the same for our program. Again, think about Las Vegas. It makes it fun. So then final line-by-line review comparing to the most recent year, just to make sure, as accountants or finance people, we like to take the last final review to make sure everything makes sense. Now, this is when we do budget for an individual program, if we're also required to do a budget for a whole department that has multiple programs, or maybe for the entire organization, we may need to combine this individual budgets in a separate spreadsheet or in a separate report, right? And this is where, if we don't have the technical skills, I'm sure we have younger people at our organization that we can rely on. They can do all the combining and additions and formulas for us. Okay, so use help from finance and admin staff, and I'm a big fan of asking younger people, such as my kids, to do some technology stuff for me. They always know more, it looks like. And then, very important, leadership need to approve the budget, preferably in writing. How does in writing happen? Well, maybe they sign off on a printed budget. Maybe they send an email. Maybe there is, just minutes of a meeting. And in the minutes, it says budget as presented is approved, right? Why is that? Well, first of all, it's the leadership's responsibility, right? Financial management is the leadership responsibility, and approved budget is their responsibility, right, as well. And probably most important, it protects everyone, right? It protects the program managers, it protects the finance staff, because for as long as your spending is within the approved budget, it prevents or mitigates those instances where somebody says, well, she does whatever she wants in her program. Like, nobody sees what she's doing there. She's the only boss in there. Who knows what she spends her money on, right? Well, if I'm spending in accordance with the budget that's formally approved by chief and council, say what you want, right? Okay, so this was about budgets for programs within the First Nation, and we'll go through all the examples towards the end. Now let's talk about budgets we prepare for proposals and those one-off programs that don't necessarily recur and continue every year. So with all proposals, there's going to be guidelines and a list of eligible and ineligible expenses and eligible and ineligible activities. So just like with everything, when a new proposal comes out, we don't know much about it. And the best way to learn is to read through those program guidelines and understand them really well. Many of new proposals would offer an information session. Like, it's normally a webinar where you can go on and they take you through all the guidelines and they take you through eligible and ineligible expenses and how to fill out their forms. You may find that that's useful, especially if you're new in proposal writing or in preparing budgets for proposals. Now, saying that, if you miss that information session, that's fine. Just read those guidelines very carefully. Make sure you understand what are the eligible activities, what are the eligible expenses, what are the ineligible ones. And if you have questions, all of these proposals, all these programs would have a contact, an email. So just email them your questions. And there is never a stupid question. They're happy to get emails from you. They hire staff that their job is to answer the emails, right? So whatever question we have is a good thing. It shows that we actually want to write a good proposal, and it shows that we're spending time on understanding the program. It's actually a big brownie point for us when they go through proposal assessment. Okay, so reach out when you have questions. It used to be that you picked up the phone, but it seems like most of the communication is done through emails now, which is a good thing in a way, because then you have the response documented, right? So if I'm asking, while we're thinking of this activity, would that qualify under the guidelines? I'd rather get the answer back in writing than somebody telling me yes on the phone, right? Because then it's documented. Now, note the maximum funding available for the program and if there is a contribution required from your organization. So recently, in the recent years, there's a lot of programs that would fund 100% of whatever the activities are. in the past, and there's still some now, there are programs that say, okay, we'll fund up to 50% or up to 80% of the activities of the program. And if that's the case, obviously that program is less attractive unless we were going to do it anyway using our own resources. And if that's the case, we need to make sure we have the resources, that extra 50 or 20% that we have to contribute before we even go into that budget, into that proposal. Now, speaking about proposals in general, I always like the cost benefit approach, because sometimes the proposal comes out, it'll end up contributing $20,000 to a program, but to write that proposal, to submit it, and to go through a reporting process is going to take me like a week altogether, right? So is it worth it? Maybe, maybe not, right? And some proposals come out and all of a sudden you can get $300,000-$400,000 after spending 2 hours on writing a proposal, right? So cost benefit here, if there is a lot of proposals out that you're looking at, definitely spend more time on the ones that give you better contribution and less hassle, right? Okay. So now, if you have questions about eligible costs or activities, contact the funder. Now, here we come to a point where, okay, we understand the program. Now we have to think about what are we going to do within our organization? What's that project going to look like? So now, I work in finance, so I don't know what the community wants to do, right? And I also don't know what's been done before, maybe, right? Not all of it, and maybe we can build on something that's been done before. Because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to create a story for the funder. We're trying to tell them, well, it's good for you to fund us because these are the needs, and you know, and we have this experience and whatnot. And based on that story, this is when our expense categories will come up, right? Now, most of these expense categories aren't going to be, you know, complicated or new. This is going to be the same expense categories we see in every program. We'll have some wages, maybe contract fees, some travel, some equipment, you know, some program related supplies and expenses, right? And lots of these expenses will be listed in that eligible expense list, right? Just pay attention to the ineligible ones too, so we know for sure what can't be included. So once we have our story, once we've contemplated, once we had a discussion, so for me, I always go to one of our counselors that is very kind of creative and aware of lots of programming and needs at the First Nation. And then we have a discussion. We go, okay, well, recent proposal came out that was from Sports Canada, and it was about physical education and sport programs for First Nation members, not just young kids, but for you know, variety of ability and variety of ages. And then we had a really good discussion, and so she said, okay, well, you know, we've never tried to implement anything like this. What if we start up a committee? What if we have a sports committee that would actually have a representative from every group in the community, and they would make recommendations about what programs are desirable, what people would attend, right? So things like this. And then once she says that, this is when, for me as a finance person, wheels are turning. Okay, a sport committee, great. How many members? How many meetings, right? Am I giving them a honorarium? And I believe that people need to be compensated for their work, even though it's great work for the community, but compensation always helps to motivate, right? Are we giving traditional gifts? Maybe we're offering some tobacco. Are we feeding them, right? So once I had the discussion, I sit down and I think it through. I think through a story, just like I thought through my trip to Las Vegas. I think through the sport committee story, and I go, okay, so they need meeting space. So say they meet once a month, 12 meetings. Say I have 5 members. They need meeting space. They need food and refreshments. They need honorarium. We'd like to offer traditional gifts, right? So those are all my cost categories now. And then how do I decide how much we pay them? Well, based on prior experience. Many times the space requirement, the rental space, can be just contributed by the band, right? So it can be your in-kind contribution to the project if you want to show some contribution, or you can charge the project for it and it becomes own source, it becomes revenue for the band, right? So if the project is going to use my, I don't know, space, there is a big hall in the arena and they're going to use it, and I have a rate of $1,000 a day that I charge for using that, well, I can charge it to the program. So a lot of it is based on my own knowledge. And if I don't know, then I talk to people at the First Nation that have that knowledge, okay? So we talked about the common cost categories, and they'll all be listed in the proposal guidelines. You don't have to, you know, think about them too much. They're pretty common. Now, does the program allow for admin expenses? So in the recent years, most programs would come out with a list of eligible costs, and they'd say, well, the program would also allow 15% of administration costs, right? And administration is the bookkeeping we're doing, is the First Nation administration, you know, all sorts of your normal admin things. So if there is an allowed admin cost, you can just use that as a percentage. You don't have to estimate exactly. So if my total ask from the project is $100,000 and there is 15% allowed as admin cost, I will just have a category of admin cost 15%. Now, I used to think that that's not okay because I'm an accountant, everything has to be exact. I used to estimate, well, bookkeeping is going to cost this much, you know, pens and paper is going to cost this much. And then I had my total for admin cost, and then I would make sure that it's within the 15%. Well, I had twice now when the funders got back to me and said, you know, you can just use 15%, you don't have to explain it. And by the way, you asked for $13,000, well, you can have 15,000 because that's what we allow for the program, okay? So that's just for your information on the admin cost. Now, if a proposal has a budget template, obviously we're going to use it. If the proposal doesn't have a budget template, I'm a big fan of using Excel. It's very user-friendly. For the ones of you that aren't familiar with Excel or don't feel good working in Excel, we're actually planning some training here, some Excel and Microsoft Office training. You can use somebody within the office who is good with Excel that can help you out, or the old pen and paper. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just more work, right? So now estimates work well for proposals. If it's a new program, we obviously don't know the exact cost, the exact amounts. Don't worry about being exact to the $10 or $100 or something. An estimate is good for as long as we show how we arrived to it, right? So just like I was talking about my sports committee, well, there is 12 meetings, 5 people in every meeting. Here is the honorarium I pay per meeting. Here's the meal cost per meeting. If I give a detail, all that funders want to see is that this number is justifiable, that I thought about it, I looked into the costs, and there is a solid background to the number, okay? So I'm of the view that the more detail we provide to the funder about how we calculated a certain cost, and as for proposal budget, the stronger our proposal is. Because again, if I just put $75,000 for something, how does, like, what shows that I actually did work on it, that I actually intelligently calculated it, as opposed to just throwing in some estimate, right? And for some things, throwing in an estimate maybe makes sense, right? But when we can show a calculation, I think it's a good idea. Okay, so then after we're done, we check the budget total and funding requested just to make sure it's within the program's limit. Because if the maximum for my First Nation is $300,000, right? Because say I'm up north and there is a certain limit, and my proposal comes in at $380,000, Well, now I have to go and adjust all sorts of costs so I'm within the funding limit, because I don't want to send a proposal out that off the bat shows the funder that I don't, I didn't consider the funding limit, right? So if the maximum amount they fund is $300,000, I'm going to be as close to that 300,000 as possible, but just below it. Okay, we're on to examples. Okay. Sorry, I have to find the right ones first. So we will start with examples for ongoing programs, okay, or ongoing operations, so to say. So here's an example of a tribal council budget, okay. So at the time it's prepared, we're using the current year or the most recent year actuals, and then we're building a budget based on that. So you'll see that here, the actual revenue for the current year is $500,000, while the proposed budget is $565,000, because in this case, we know there is an increase, more money is coming. There is a line here called deferred from prior years. So what it is if we had a surplus last year, remember how it's not good to have surpluses? Well, now we get to carry it forward and spend it in the current year, right? So in addition to my funds income from the government, I also have to worry about spending last year's surplus. It's not too high here, but it has to be considered, okay? And then you'll see here that there is actual expense amounts with my usual categories, right? And there are the exact amounts coming from my accounting software, right? And an actual surplus or deficit. And then my proposed expense amounts, they may be either close to the actual expenses, like for instance, audit fees. Well, I'm hoping my auditors are gonna bill me around the same as last year, right? And then, and notice here that in the budget, my numbers are pretty rounded, right? Because if I use, say, the same number as last year, like 19,560, or increase it by 5% with some different exact number, it's almost like less of a good tool, because I'm never going to be at that exact number. So when I put here $20,000, I'm saying I'm going to be in the ballpark of that amount. So it actually makes it more meaningful, because anything in the ballpark of $20,000 is good. That's what I'm saying, right? And if I budget exactly 19,560, that's kind of, well, it's not realistic. I'm never going to be at exactly the same amount unless I really pound on the auditors and say you have to bill me exactly the same, right? Which they're not going to appreciate. So now for some other categories, you'll see that I have different amounts from like significantly different, like advertising was $1,300 last year, and I'm expecting to spend $7,000. Well, last year was probably COVID, and here I'm going to spend more effort on maybe some community relations and promotion work, right? So again, this is based on a discussion with program management, what we're planning to do. Things like equipment purchases, right? Maybe I didn't do any last year, but I'm planning to buy some computers or something this year, and so on and so forth. You'll see that my wages here are a more exact number, and so is the EI expense here, right? Because here I wasn't lazy and I did the exact calculation by employee and by month, and I included raises and maybe some new part-time staff. My employment insurance expense is just a set percentage of payroll, so it's more exact. Everything else, again, is just based on my knowledge of current operations and the plans for the program, and we don't have to be exact, just in the ballpark, right? Now, for this particular program, my goal is to not have a surplus or deficit, is to be balanced. So that's what I'd like to see. And it's a realistic goal, because look at last year, I was almost balanced. There was only $6,000 surplus here, right? Which again, $6,000 surplus last year has to be carried over in the next year's budget and spent then, right? Okay, let's look at a different example. So this is an example of a community gas and grocery store budget. Okay, so you'll see here, whoever did it wanted to be a little fancier. So they used the gross profit percentage, so how much margin, how much markup there is on different products, on grocery, tobacco, and gas. And then they calculated purchases based on those percentages. Again, unnecessarily, really, like somebody just wanted to be more fancier here, which is fine. So now why I wanted to show this one is because they used the actual calculation for wages we spoke about. Okay, so you'll see here I have a list of all of my employees, and then I have 12 months, right? That's an annual budget. And then in here I also have an indication of which months have 3 pay periods, right? So it becomes more exact. Now, everything in here is a formula driven by the number of hours people work and their hourly rate. Okay, number of hours and hourly rate. Again, if you're not familiar with Excel, get help from somebody who is, or pen and paper, or just estimate, what I call the lazy way, right? Now, in addition to this, Excel is very useful in a way, because here, if I give somebody a raise down the road, because you'll see here, I'm starting with a certain biweekly amount. Sorry. Yeah, there we go. Technology. So you'll see I'm starting the year with a certain biweekly rate, and then down the road, I'm expecting to give people increases. So if you're doing it in Excel, it's a pretty easy calculation to accommodate for that and give people increases in the middle of the year. Now, so at the bottom, we will have our total wages, and then my EI is going to be just a calculation based on that. And so is my group insurance and pension, because I know the percentage we pay. Okay, and then I have total wages, and all these numbers very easily carry over to my budget. Okay, and then I have my usual, like all the rest of the expenses and the surplus or deficit. But the main reason I wanted to show you this one is for detailed wage calculation. So let's look at another one. Okay, so one of my communities builds a winter road every year. And what happens is they're always in a deficit and nobody is quite sure how much it costs. So what we did back at the time is we sat down with a manager who's in charge of construction, winter road construction, and we went through the story. This is just an illustration of what we do here. Just like I planned my trip to Las Vegas, which I said it so many times now that I'm gonna have to go. But here I'm like, okay, what do we do here? Well, tell me about winter road. It goes, okay, well, there is the construction stage and maintenance stage. And as he speaks, we type in that, right? Can be right in Excel, or it can be on a piece of paper, whatever works for you. It goes, well, I need 6 experienced workers, and I'm gonna pay, I'm okay, well, how much we're gonna pay them per hour? How many days are they going to work, right? And we have all of this here, right? And then my calculation is based on all that information. He goes, he needs 2 equipment operators at a certain hourly rate, certain number of days. And then we keep going into the equipment, into the gas, and so on and so forth. So we basically taking the story, taking the plan of construction and putting it down as expense, as cost categories, just like my Vegas flight, hotel, meals, and gambling expenses, right? Okay, so now that winter road project is ongoing. So since we built the first year, we can just take last year, compare it to actual, and adjust as necessary, right? Now, let's look, for the sake of time here, at our program budgets. So the first one, let me just go into, I think they're all in PDF. Yes. Okay, well, I wanted to show you an example of an unrealistic budget. Somebody got lazy and used last year's, right? They fixed themselves since it was 2019. So that's bench support budget. You'll notice that in the program schedules of a First Nation audit, there are always budgets, right? So ISC want to see budgets. That's our responsibility to provide that. So you'll see here, I have bench support funding schedule, and everything in the budget is completely off from actual by much, right? Now, is it possible that my ISC revenue increased by 200,000 from the budget? It's possible, but not very likely, right? I think we just used previous year's budget without adjusting it. Okay, you'll see also here that none of the other revenue categories are considered. You'll see the expense categories nothing really works really well here, right? Lots of the expense categories are missing. Some of them are too high, some of them are too low, right? Like, look, we budgeted $5,400 in wages, and our actual was 212,000. So if we show something like this, we don't look very professional, right? So in my budgeted deficit was $30,000. My actual deficit was $224,000. And in the prior year, it was over $500,000. So clearly my budget is unrealistic and not useful. And presenting a budget like this also makes a bad impression, right? Now, it can be that at the time I prepared the budget, it was realistic, but then something changed. There's extraordinary circumstances, right? All of a sudden there is more funding and we have to expand. That's good. That's okay. We can explain this. But this one, the program is the same. It just shows that somebody didn't quite do good work on preparing that budget. So we want to stay away from it. Okay, so back to, let's talk about program budgets. So here's an example of a proposal, a budget for a proposal for a powwow through Canadian Heritage. So that program is there every year. The template doesn't change. If you do it once, you'll just use the same template every time. So they, in this case, Canadian Heritage, provide a budget template, right? All we have to do is fill it out. So because we had a previous powwow, we know the actual expenses, and then we can base our planned expenses on last year's actual, right? And then there's a column here for funds and requested, right? So it's pretty straightforward. If it is my first year and I'm not quite sure, well, it's my best estimate, because again, for a powwow, I know approximate number of dancers. I know the honorariums I'm gonna pay them. Like, look at here, we have the fees, expenses, and transportation for artists. It's like very high level, everything is lumped together. And I can tell you that the first year I prepared it, I broke it down to different categories. And Canadian Heritage actually reached out and asked me to lump it in together because they didn't want too much details on this category, right? But you'll see it's like pretty straightforward. It tells you the category, you do your best to estimate. And again, like if you spend more, you'll adjust next year's proposal. If you spend more, they're gonna give you only exactly as much as they wanna give you anyway. So it doesn't matter. If you spend less, that's a bit of an issue. You may have to repay it, but it rarely happens that you spend less, right? So it's pretty straightforward. We just go through different categories that are here, we fill it out. And then at the bottom, they always want to make sure that my total revenues agree to my total expenses. They would like a balanced budget. So if there is a check like this, you just follow the instructions, and it's not too complex. It's pretty straightforward. If you have any questions, you just reach out to them and they help you out. So let's look at the next one. For the sake of time, there is the Sports Canada proposal I spoke about, Community Sport Committee. So Sport Canada, for their proposal, didn't really provide a good budget template. Within the proposal body, there was just a list of expenses, their categories and funds and requested, right? So for the sport committee that I talked about, Community Sport Committee, again, we had some honorariums, we had some refreshments for the meetings, we had traditional gifts and meeting stays for the committee. Those are my categories. And you'll see that here, I like to provide my calculation, even though there is you can't show the calculation within the amounts, right? I like to provide my calculation to them. That proposal still hasn't been approved, so I don't know if it's good or not, but there is a third round. They actually have a third round of proposals tailored to women and LGBTQ community. So if you haven't applied for the second round, definitely check it out. It may be worth applying something new. But this is just an example when their template is pretty basic. They want an expense category, an amount, and how much of that you request, right? And then in my view, I like to provide more details of how I calculated it. Because if I just throw 15,600 in committee meeting honorariums without explaining it, maybe it seems too high or too low or unreasonable or unclear, right? When I say, well, there is 8 members, 13 meetings, 150 per member, that all of a sudden has a different feeling to it. Okay, so now let's look at another proposal, professional institutional development. This one is actually still out there. It's due on February 21st. So if you haven't applied for your First Nation, definitely look into it. So you'll see that here, it's the same idea in the budget as was for Sport Canada. Okay, so here they have just a budget item. And they tell you, okay, tuition and training, salaries and wages, they tell you all the eligible expenses, and then there is other expense. You can put a description. You can actually, you can show calculation here because they give you rate of cost and unit. It can be per hour, per day, per month. And then it calculates the overall total for you for that category. So it provides quite a bit of calculation details to the government in this one already, right? And again, I'm a fan of whatever, the more information you can provide of how you arrived at something, the better. So if I want to send my staff to say AFOA next year, well, I can download conference information and cost, and I can attach this as a separate attachment. They always have an ability to attach supports and documents here, right? But the more support we can show and the more details we can show, the better. If their budget doesn't allow for this details, then I would still provide it in the description. Okay, so now I know we're past the time. I'm just gonna quickly show you what I meant by read the proposal guidelines. So these are the Professional Institutional Development Program guidelines, right? They're pretty short. Like, look at it. It's not that long, right? A lot of it is going to be not even like that important. Assessment and approval. Yeah, you read it once in the application, you're not going to care about it after. But what is important to read here, right, is to give us eligible projects, list of eligible projects. They give us examples of eligible and ineligible projects. So if we have something in mind, like I have that AFOA conference in mind, I can read through this and decide, okay, is it eligible? Is it ineligible, right? They have a list of eligible expenses. Now that's gonna help me decide whether my proposed project costs are eligible, but it's also gonna help me with creating a budget, right? Because it gives me a list of expenses that are eligible under the project. And then we have examples of eligible and ineligible. It's good to understand the ineligible costs, right? Because sometimes something isn't very clear. Again, it's good to email them with any questions. They're normally good with responding and explaining, and it's good to start that communication ahead of time so they know proposal is coming and they know we're diligently working and asking questions about them. Okay, so we will stop here, and hopefully you got some useful information. So thank you for your time.